Yes.
I guess I don't see any notes.
Something else. Is it 45 minutes? Well, set alarm 45 minutes. And then I'll load it just quickly. Yes, a bit too much.
It's when it gets 6:10. Some people are still there.
And I can listen to it.
Yeah. Very much.
Hey, noswaith da pawb. Good evening, everybody. Just i ddechrau, ar ran grŵp cenedlaethol Cymrodi'r Gymdeithas na Fiaith o'r Llundain, dwi'n credu o'r enw'r Gymdeithas hon. Croeso cynnig sy'n pawb sy'n bresennol yma yn y ddalithfa a pawb sy'n ymuno ni dros y we hefyd i'r cyfarfod y noson hon. Pleser newydd yw hi eleni i estyn cylch a'n cyfarfodydd yma yn Nghymru i Abertawe, ond pleser enfawr yw hi hefyd bod y cyfarfod heno, y cyfle cyntaf i ni ddathlu diweddiant y gymdeithas ar gyfer yr ymgyrch i sicrhau dyfodol y gymdeithas yn ei phancadlys yn Burlington House. Llongyfarchiadau o galon i'r lywydd, Martin, a i gymdeithwyr hefyd am pob ymdrech sydd wedi rhoi i mewn i'r ymgyrch i nôl y nod hon. Mewn gwirionedd, rydym ni fel aelodau'r gymdeithas yma yn Cymru yn gallu bod yn falch iawn bod ni hefyd wedi cyfrannu yn sylweddol at y holl frwydr oedd yn angenrheidiol. So that was just a few words, of course, of welcome to everybody here, to Swansea, everybody who's joining us, of course, on the web as well. And in particular to say, it's not just a great pleasure and an honour to come here to Swansea this evening, but that this is the first time that the Society is meeting formally after the great news about the success of the campaign to stay in Burlington House. And, we can all feel really pleased about it and really look forward now to doing good things in the future on that basis. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, John. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting, Thursday the 7th of March 2024, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday the 29th of February 2024 were read and signed. The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, were duly admitted fellows. Peter J. Persgler. The following communication was then laid before the Society: Brian Hope Taylor, 1923 to 2001, and Northumbria, a centenary reassessment of excavations and interpretations at Yevering and Doonhill Dunbar by Ian Ralston, FSA, and Roger Mackett. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 14th of March 2024 in Swansea, and then adjourned the meeting and a reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a lecture by our fellow Dr. Alex Langdon. Welcome, Alex. Or I think it's the other way around, isn't it? Alex, as you probably be aware, is Associate Professor of History and Heritage in the Department of History, Heritage and Classics here at Swansea University. So it's us coming to you rather than the other way round. He worked in commercial archaeology, broadcast media, and has an academic specialism in medieval landscape studies. This evening, he's sharing key findings from over a decade of research at Old Sarum and its surrounding landscape, the medieval period. This work, which I'm fascinated to hear more about, has really been re-examining a number of assumptions, beliefs about the site, deploying a range of new methods, and very much looking forward to it. So welcome, Alex.
Many thanks. So I hope camera is in focus. Excellent. Well, thanks to colleagues, associates, and friends who have generously given their time to come and support me this evening. A big thanks to Swansea University as well for hosting the event. And thanks to as well to the Society of Antiquaries, who through the Margaret and Tom Jones Fund have funded much of the work that I'm going to talk about today. I actually lived just over the brow of this hill over 10 years ago. And that was when I first started wandering around Old Sarum and thinking, yeah, there's something quite important here. And it's taken sort of 10 years, I regret to say, 10 years to get to this point where I can bring together some of the findings. And I think that's largely because of a job move, house move, kids, COVID, lockdown, all those things. But it's also because this is an enormous site and the landscape around it, which we've done a lot of work on as well, is also enormous. There's a lot to take in, and I'm slightly worried today it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll try and touch on the various parts of the landscape and the monument that we've looked at and some of the sort of conclusions that we're coming to. So I started with this, sorry, there we are. I've used this quote from a poem by the court poet, Henry of Avranches. He was writing in the early part of the 13th century, and his poem was almost certainly written to commemorate the move of the cathedral from Old Sarum down to the present site where we have that glorious cathedral today. And I've started with this because a number of scholars have used this line as a stepping off point to think about where Old Sarum was and what Old Sarum was. And bit of a spoiler alert here, I think Henry of Avranches actually was using this term because to a contemporary audience, the ambiguity of this wordplay, I think it played to the sense that actually at that time, no one really knew what it was. It wasn't entirely clear what Old Sarum was. And that's a situation that persists today. I actually took this photograph from a Cessna airplane flying over Old Sarum, and I said to the pilot, could you circle Old Sarum one more time so I could get a better shot? And it took me a while before I realised that actually he was circling the airfield. Old Sarum Airfield, which you can see, I've taken this photograph from the website of the Save Old Sarum Airfield website. It's a really important campaign at the moment to save what I think is a really important part of our aviation history. And then if you type into Google Old Sarum, what comes up here is the modern estate that's been built alongside the Portway there and Old Sarum Primary School, a really good example of placemaking here. Old Sarum Primary School in the centre of that estate. We've had the privilege of working with students there on some of our excavations. And if we look at Historic England's archive image of Sorbio Dunum, Roman Sarum, it's not clear there where exactly the site was. So this is a situation that persists to the day. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of my findings. So I thought for today's agenda, I'd consider the location of the town, the medieval settlement, the city of Old Sarum. I'll also look at the internal divisions, the radial banks, and the arrangement of space within the monument. I'll move on then to look at the suburban, and I've got that in inverted commas because they may indeed be the urbs that sit outside of the ringwork. And finally, I'll finish up by talking about the scale and symmetry of the monument. Now, just to the uninitiated, Old Sarum was almost certainly an Iron Age hill fort. It was adapted, it was the focus of Roman activity, adapted by the Romans almost certainly. And it then, I think it has an early medieval history. It's relatively elusive, but I'm going to talk about some bits and pieces today I think suggest something is going on in the early medieval period. But the monument you see there in the LiDAR is very much a creation of the later 11th century and a Norman colonial project. Now, one of the things I'm not going to talk about are the excavations from 1909 to 1915, because in many ways these are quite well covered in the academic literature. These excavations, unfortunately, were never fully brought to publication because of the untimely death of the chief archaeologist, William St. John, in 1919. All we have surviving from the excavations are a series of reports read out to the Society of Antiquaries. We have William Hawley, Lieutenant Colonel William Hawley's field diaries, which are held at Salisbury Museum. We've got a series of maps and plans. There is, it turns out, a notebook in the Society of Antiquaries library of William St. John's, very scratchy, not very detailed notebook. And we've got a handful of photographs taken by D.H. Montgomery, who was also the site surveyor. And the focus of those excavations was really to target the medieval architectural structures. And that was what William St. John was really interested in, was the phasing of those medieval structures. And as I say, this is relatively well covered ground in the literature, and I'll touch on elements of those findings. One of the things I have done is I've digitally reconstructed those excavations from William Hawley's diaries. And that's been a really useful exercise in the sense that it's enabled me to identify where and when they were excavating, what they were finding in particular places, what is covered by the drawings record, what is covered by the photographic record. And there's a few nice bits and pieces that have come out of that, not least the depths of the original monument, the depths of the footings, the foundations, and clusters of certain finds, which I think are indicative of pre-Norman activity on the hill. But as I say, I'm not going to say too much about that. I want to return to this idea of where the city, where the town of Old Sarum was. And one of the things that's emerged in the popular literature most recently is this idea of the bustling and thriving medieval citadel model. And the first iteration of this idea of the medieval citadel, the sort of classic, if you like, European hilltop fortified town, the first iteration comes in Merryweather's depiction there, which is a sort of vignette which is features as part of a larger plan and section of Old Sarum, which was published in 1761. And it's quite fanciful, but it is interesting because there are elements in the model and its plan which do relate to some of the topographic features in the monument. So it's not complete work of fiction. And then we have, in some ways, the sort of essence of that medieval citadel in John Thorpe's wonderful 1920s model, which for a long time was in the cloister at Salisbury Cathedral, where again we get this vision of this classic sort of medieval European hilltop settlement. But I just want to interrogate that a little bit. I'm going to start off by mentioning the geophysical surveys that have been undertaken by Chris Strutt, Don Barker and the team from Southampton University. They've done a huge amount of work. I think it's fair to say the geophysical surveys, both within the monument and outside the monument, are radically transforming the way we think about this landscape. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with these guys. And I'll be drawing on some of their findings. And if you look at the work they've done in the Hill Fort, it looks kind of busy, doesn't it? It's a pretty busy place. The question we need to ask ourselves is, to what extent does this material relate to the 12th century? To what extent does it reflect a burgeoning, bustling and thriving settlement? Because actually, where we have excavations that do penetrate below the Norman levels, we've got evidence of actually quite a lot of activity. And I'm only going to give a couple of examples here. You'll see down at the bottom here on this slide, I've inked up here a section through the castle monument that was drawn by D.H. Montgomery. It's unpublished, it's in the National Monuments Record. So I scanned this up and I've inked it up. And I just want to draw your attention to this well here, which is a false and unfinished well. The excavation team in 1911, I think it was in around May time, they started excavating this well and they found out that it was an unfinished well. Something must have been said in the course of the season, because they get to the end of the season in October and they decide to go into the well and punch through the staining of the well, locate the original ground surface here. You can see this line running through. I'm sorry if it's a bit faint. They wanted to locate the original ground surface and cut 2 galleries along that ground surface to see what was there. And I just think that is such a tantalizing opportunity to literally excavate the last days of Anglo-Saxon England. Now, what do they find? The gallery that heads off in a north direction here, and this is Montgomery publishing a lot later in 1947, I should say. This gallery uncovered the natural gravel of the hillside. And on top of that, we've got a pebble floor of round chalk, getting Roman pottery out of this. But on top of that, we have between 3 and 4 feet's worth of what Montgomery and Hawley would call midden rubbish. Okay, which to us is sort of priceless environmental deposits. Okay, that midden rubbish. They also talk about Norman pottery being found here, but my suspicion is that this is probably what we would call Saxo-Norman pottery, and a ware type that is maybe 10th and 11th century. So again, evidence of something there before the motte is thrown up. But actually, the gallery they cut to the east is even more interesting, because what they do is come up against a wall. Now, it's unfortunate that Hawley, who was a royal engineer, punched through that wall before it could be recorded. It was very thick, though. It survived to a height of over 5 feet. Now, it is possible that this was, as Montgomery and the excavators suspected, a Roman wall, surviving 600 years after the late 4th century to a height of 5 feet. It is possible. But actually, if we look at Montgomery's sketch here of that wall, we can see that cut ashlar blocks are being reused within a wall, along with flint cobbling. And this is actually very reminiscent of the nave walls, the outside of the nave walls at St Mary sub Castro, which we believe to be an 11th century church building. So I think this structure could very well be of early medieval date. I think it's potentially reusing Roman material. It's got very thick walls. It could be a tower, certainly positioned in the optimum place within the monument to look along the Roman roads towards the monument. So I think the point I'll make here is, in this very small area of excavation, there's actually a lot of information and a lot of activity going on at this site. If Old Sarum is anything like Danebury and South Cadbury, which have received really rather extensive open area excavations, we know that site is going to be peppered with Iron Age features as well. I've talked about the Roman remains. Elsewhere in the monument, where a trench was cut through the curtain wall in the northeast quarter, where the excavators got below the medieval deposits, they uncovered in a relatively small trench quite a lot of Roman material as well, with building materials in amongst what they recovered. Something early medieval. I think there's a case for that. And in every single excavation that's been undertaken on Old Sarum and immediately around it, well, actually not in the suburbs, there is evidence of post-medieval activity, features that are cut in down through the post-medieval or late medieval demolition layers. Okay, and then there's all the activity that we have in the 18th century and 19th century with local militias and what's going on during 2 world wars in the 20th century. So it's going to have been a busy place. We can only, through agency of the pick, shovel and trowel, tease out exactly which of those geophysical features relate to that 12th century. So it's all up for grabs. The other thing I'm going to just scrutinise here as well are these radial banks, these internal divisions within the monument, because for a long time, these have been interpreted as divisions between the secular and the ecclesiastical structures within the monument. So it's kind of a division between church and state. And this is an illustration dating from 1977 from the Royal Commission's volume that offers a sequence for development in the monument from around about, I would say around about 1060 AD through to maybe 1090. Well, actually, no, 1140, I would say. But I'm going to interrogate these banks, and I'm going to start with this one here, the northeast radial bank. It's immediately alongside a tunnel, which was first identified in the 18th century and then was excavated in the 1950 by John Musty and Philip Ratz. Here's their section through the tunnel, and you can see here, there's the tunnel. There's the natural chalk of the rampart. Here is interpreted as a Roman layer, and here we have the medieval layer on top. Again, there's some of this post-medieval activity. There were even actually in these excavations a record of prior excavations that have been unrecorded, undocumented excavations. Now, this tunnel was unfinished. It was not stone-lined, and the excavators at the time used the pottery that appears in the layer entering the tunnel to date the tunnel. So you've got 12th and 13th century medieval pottery sitting in this layer as it enters the tunnel. Now, my reinterpretation on this, or my word of caution, is simply that if this is a very brief event, it's highly possible that the pottery recovered from that layer is redeposited, residual medieval pottery that's found itself redeposited when this tunnel is cut. So we have a terminus postquem, a time after which the tunnel is cut, rather than the time at which the tunnel is cut. And the excavators even say that radial bank may very well be the consequence of the upcast from the cutting of this tunnel and the large open area that they dug out to get to the entrance of the tunnel. I think this is a recent discovery, an excavation by Wessex Archaeology here of what's called a sconce. This is a 17th century fort, almost certainly relates to Civil War activity in this landscape. It's on the Marlborough Road. It's a short distance north of Old Sarum. It's within sight of Old Sarum. And again, this fort is unfinished. And this is the publication, Wiltshire Archaeological Natural History Magazine. It's actually available online. So we've got another unfinished monument in the landscape. And I wonder whether actually this radial bank is the upcast from the cutting of a tunnel at that time. The curtain wall looks like it's been refortified as well at this time. And my interpretation, therefore, of this bank, which is very, very different from its opposing bank on the south of the monument, I wonder whether this bank is a bulwark, defensive bulwark against potential ingress from the west. So it's protecting that flank. So I'm not saying this isn't medieval, but what I'm saying is there's also a case to suggest that this could be activity relating to the 17th century and what's going on for a very, very brief period at Salisbury during the Civil War. Let's have a look at the South Radial Bank. Now, my interpretation of this, I haven't unfortunately got a photograph of it because I lost my phone. I had a really good photograph of this. And if you look at the profile of this bank, it slopes up in a direct line up to the castle. And my suspicion here is that this is a crude ramp that's thrown up to improve access to the castle for all of the stone that we know is robbed out of it. Right up until the 16th century, this monument is being robbed of its stone. It's a lot easier to take the stone directly over the monument this way, to take it down the portway, very easy bit of road to the Avon River, where it could be floated all the way down to the Cathedral Close, where we know all of this stone is being reused in the wall around the Cathedral Close and in many of the structures down there. A lot easier than taking it out the East Gate, down here, onto a road, 1.5 miles through a busy medieval city. So my suspicion is here that this is to do with the demolition of the monument. So I've called those radial banks into question, which in turn calls into question the traditional narrative of this monument being divided between the church and state. And there are other things going on in this monument which we haven't currently got answers for. As I said, St John Hope and William Hawley, to a certain extent, they were kind of really interested in the medieval architectural phases, what was going on this site. And D.H. Montgomery, he actually had an eye for some of the other things that were going on in this monument. And this photograph, I think, is really instructive. You're stood here in the southwest corner, right up against the southwest corner of the nave, the 11th century nave. Added to that nave, we believe in the 12th century, were two large west towers for which we have the foundations for. The interpretation of this pit here that's dug into up against the foundations by the excavators, this was a demolition pit. So you undermine the corner of the tower and then you drop the tower towards you. And I'm quite happy with that interpretation. I'm also happy that we're quite close to the medieval ground surface here, because elsewhere in the Canon's Close, here the Canon's Cemetery, what we see are the headstones have been clipped by 19th century ploughing. So I think we've got horizontal truncation across the site here. Now, what all of this means, because this pit is cut from so high, is that we've got an original buried ground surface here. Is it the original buried ground surface of the Iron Age hill fort before the Normans raised it up? Maybe not, because we've got another one down here as well. And it's not as if these are localized deposits. We've got the same thing continuing through here. And in a further photograph, you can see. So this is a lot more complex than the narrative we currently have for this site. And you can see again here, this is a photograph taken looking north across the well house, which we think is one of the earliest features on the site, maybe even reusing a Roman well site. But you can see here where they've cut down to chase the foundations. You can see that there are lots of different layers in here as well. So it is quite a complicated monument. And I want to come back actually to what Hawley called the terraplan, the creation of this platform towards the end of the session. So we've got many questions that remain about this monument. The nature of settlement in the Outer Bailey. Is it urban? Is that where the city is? Or are we looking at two extensive ecclesiastical and secular palatial complexes? What other periods might be represented in this monument as well? Because certainly in these excavations, there's lots of stuff that was coming out as they were excavating that dates to the Roman period and possibly even some early medieval material as well. What were the internal divisions within the Outer Bailey? We need to interrogate that. To what extent was the hilltop reconfigured in the 11th century, and what was going on in the minds of the Norman colonisers? Okay, I'm going to come back to those 2 points at the end of the session and wrap up with them. But what I'm going to do now is get us outside of the monument, and I'm going to start with the west suburbs, because the Margaret and Tom Jones Fund, administered by the Society of Antiquaries, allowed myself and Chris Strutt at Southampton University to sort of throw the kitchen sink at the west suburbs. Well, actually wasn't a lot of work, not a lot of work had been done in the west suburbs. There was a gas pipeline put in 1969 and watched by members of the Salisbury Museum Archaeology Group, and David Algar very kindly shared all of his notes on that, and I've been able to sort of reconstruct from his notes where all the features were. This is all published in the grey literature here. And there was a Royal Commission did an earthwork survey as well. We looked at the LiDAR in some detail. We did cartographic analysis. There's really quite wonderful set of aerial photographs, as you'd imagine, being right next to an airfield. Some really rather wonderful aerial photographs. And without sort of telling you the whole story of the west suburbs, the thing I really want to draw to your attention is that underlying the reconfiguration of this landscape in, I think, the 13th century, underlying it, we've got evidence for a rectilinear enclosure here, straddling what I think was the Roman road coming out of the West Gate. And we know from documentary sources that the canons had their houses and gardens either side of the road running up to the castle. So I'm quite happy with that. And we put some trial trenches in with students from both Southampton University and Swansea University. We put some trial trenches in, took some environmental samples, all of which have been assessed and are published in the grey lit here, just to characterise those deposits. And we're quite happy that what we've got here are the canons closest. Now, the significance of this is that what we have in Old Sarum, as some of you will know, Old Sarum is really important in terms of the role it plays in the development of liturgical practices in the medieval church. That's the real significance around Old Sarum and its church. The English secular cathedral is in the throes of innovation at this time. And what we have here is almost the complete footprint of that plan for the English cathedral church at this time. And as a consequence, we can analyse the arrangement of space, and small questions about how communal the life of the clerics living and working in this cathedral can be answered by looking at that arrangement of space there. I mean, that's very, very similar to what we might consider a sort of urban morphology, individual plots laid out against a road. There's a level of a limited individualism that comes with this community. So this could be potentially quite instructive. And like I say, we've got pretty much the complete footprint, what with the cathedral and its ancillary buildings within the monument. Let's go over to the east side now, where for quite a long time we've suspected there is some kind of urban or suburban settlement. Hidden away in the archives at Historic England was a record of an excavation undertaken in 1967 when the ablutions block, or rather the observation block, in the monument was converted into an ablutions block. So a sewer pipe was cut all the way down through the monument, down through the eastern suburb. This is a remarkable record. This is a section through a medieval city. And what's even more remarkable is that Trevor Miles and David Algar drew pretty much every stone within that section. And it's an absolute delight. I'm not going to go through every single element in it because I can see you're already glazing over. It's the kind of thing that floats my boat. But we can see it's very, very busy. We can see that there are lots of features cut from quite high up, so lots of post-medieval features. We've got a fantastic record here of the East Gate, numerous surfaces, and the construction cut for that, the walls here, which I think are late 13th, 14th century. You can see that construction cut comes through earlier material as well. And some of from the sondage, we may have some Saxo-Norman material there. So again, 10th, 11th century into the 12th century material. There's evidence of structures here. There's a building here as we make our way out the East Gate. We've got, honestly, they drew every single stone. We've got successive floor surfaces, and anyone who's interested in castle architecture, it looks for all the world here, and this is Trevor Miles suggesting this, that what you have here is evidence for a swing bridge. and I'm not sure of any other excavated example of a swing bridge. So that's quite nice. And then we get to outside the monument. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the east suburbs. We're immediately outside the castle gate, where we have a building, very crude floor, a couple of drip gullies, so maybe 2 phases of thatching there. We've got road surfaces, another small building here, and then we get our cesspits. And pretty much everywhere that's been excavated in and around Old Sarum has yielded cesspits, and the level of preservation in these cesspits is really, really high. So the evidential significance of this monument and the potential, archaeological potential for this monument is incredibly high. We go a bit further and we tend to get these collections of cesspits in the Old Sarum hinterland. And in this case, we've got cut into the top of the cesspit. These cesspits have already slumped, they've already stabilised, and then a building is cut into the top of it. I think it's a crude molting floor that. That is the only post-medieval feature that is cut into the archaeology there. So again, the levels of preservation in some parts of these suburbs are really, really high. These cesspits are cutting through a Romano-British, late Iron Age Romano-British ditch, and there's actually a burial from within here as well. We continue on down, we cross over the line of the Roman road on its way to Dorchester. And just the other side of that, short distance, we have what looks to be a cellared, chalk-lined cellared building with potential steps coming in from the road, and a later medieval pit just sitting outside of that. So how does that all fit in with what we already know about the east suburbs? And this is really the first time in which we've managed to bring together all of the data from the east suburbs to offer some kind of synthesis. I'll start off with the red lines, the roads. Everywhere you can see the thick, dark red line, that's excavated road surfaces. And this is Musty and Ratz's interpretation of the road. There's our Roman road, having come out of Sorvio Dunum, or at least the hill fort, heading off down towards the crossing of the Avon, as I say, on its way to Dorchester. It's picked up in this trench as well. This is a 1973 sewer trench cut down to the main line. This was watched by David Algar again, who took meticulous notes, and I'm very grateful for him sharing those. I've managed from his measurements to plot these features. So there's our road network. Now, what's really interesting is that the buildings that were excavated here in 1958 are aligned to that road. There's another building here that was excavated in 1933. Lots of burials from around it, and actually burials cut into the nave as well. And we know from the historical sources that this is almost certainly the Church of the Holy Rood, which is described as being ultra or beyond the east gate. And underlying the earliest floor to the church is a pit containing, this doesn't happen very often, a coin of William I. Okay, handy. It's never happened to me, that, unfortunately. Okay, so we're starting to get some dating here on the earliest phases of this work. I've worked with Chris's geophysical survey plots, picked out what he thinks are evidence for walls. What's really interesting in the blue here is that the alignment of these walls and these buildings shares very much the alignment of the excavated examples. And what's even more tantalizing is we've got that cellar building I mentioned here. There's the road. Well, David Algar picked up another chalk-lined cellar building, equidistant from the road on the other side of the road. So we pull all this together, and what it looks like we have is we have a Norman new town founded at the point at which the work is going on in the castle. There are analogues for this. Brinklow is a very good example. And if we look at the geophysical survey from further down the hill, you can see that you've got, again, that continued alignment following the line of the Roman road. Tantalizingly, these two ditches are either associated with this is a proposed demolition scaffolding or something like that, or may even be Iron Age ditches for rounding up cattle into an original entrance to the monument. Now, if we carry on further down the portway, so this is a deep Holloway now down to the crossing of the River Avon. At some point, the Roman road was no longer used. The portway sort of makes its way round what we now think is the sort of main mercantile centre of Sorvio Dunum. There's been a controlled metal detecting survey of this area published by Richard Henry and Alex Smith, which really largely confirms, and actually Chris's most recent geophysical survey suggests that this is a really quite busy place, Sorvio Dunum. But again, if we look at the portable antiquities scheme, we see that in red, there's just as much medieval non-coin related artifacts coming out of this area as there is Roman. There's lots more Roman coins, should be said. And then over here, what I've done is I've teased out from small archaeological interventions undertaken as part of the planning process. I've teased out the evidence for medieval material culture and structural remains. We've definitely got quite a busy medieval place down here, and my suspicion is that this really is the sort of successful medieval site. If I just peel back here very, very briefly to look at this site. These buildings, their first phase is very ephemeral. Post holes, wattle daub, probably thatched as well. The second phase has got more robust building materials. So Portland stone, Chilmark stone, green sandstone, some nice glazed roof tiles. But a lot of it is being reused. And I think this sort of second phase is actually recycling material from the monument. So I don't think that this place ever really properly got off the ground. Whereas further down here by the river, as you would expect, where the mill is, where you can get a drink, and by that I mean water, not beer, or maybe beer. I think this is the busier place. Now, what's the origins of this settlement down here? Geophysical surveys, this time conducted by David Sabine and Kerry Donaldson at Cowslip Farm here, and by Wessex Archaeology here on the other side of the river, probably got the edge here of the fortlet, the Roman fortlet. But on the other side of the river, we've got the line of the Roman road. We've got this spur going off, which you can see as a parch mark as well, actually. And then you've got these plots laid out perpendicular to the Roman road. Now, that doesn't preclude it being a Roman settlement at all. And there's certainly Roman material coming up from the metal detecting surveys on this side. But intriguingly, another coin. This spur goes up through quite a deep holloway that's cut up the scarp slope, and the metal detector recovered a coin of Edgar 960s from that holloway. So I think we almost certainly have the name Kingsbridge as well, indicative of early medieval origins. I think we've got an early medieval settlement there, and possibly the location of the Domesday borough. But again, unless we excavate, unless we target excavations to try and assess this, we won't know. But comparative analysis, if we look around, we can see that there are other similar sites throughout Wessex, and I've teased out just a mere handful. These are what I call borough bridges or bridge boroughs. For too often we've tried to find King Alfred's boroughs as sort of fortified settlements. I think almost certainly the construction of the causeway, the bridge, is just as important as the defensive monument. And what the late Anglo-Saxon kings are doing as well is they're connecting up their mercantile and administrative centres. And I make this point in my book, The Ancient Ways of Wessex. So we've got some comparable examples, and there's a classic example here is Langport in Somerset, referred to in the early 10th century. Again, we've got a portway that runs across the floodplain here. We've got Bow Street, the Cheapside, the marketplace, and we've got those perpendicular plots. The same thing going on at Stockbridge, on a road that connects up Winchester with Old Sarum and Wilton, so a major highway where again we've got evidence for a borough, albeit a little bit later than this period. But Wilton, we've got archaeological and documentary evidence that North Street and South Street, which do exactly the same thing, are there by the 11th century. So I'm quite happy that Kingsbridge reflects what the late Anglo-Saxon kings were doing in Wessex in the 10th and into the 11th century. So just to conclude then on the suburbs, there's something we've certainly with our work got a much better idea of what's going on in the east suburb and in the west suburbs. Not only have we got those cannons closest, but we've also found later medieval house platforms, a sort of deserted medieval village as they're sometimes called. We've also found evidence for a Saxo-Norman settlement quite close to the river crossing, we think. Very little Roman material and almost no prehistoric material, has to be said. In the east suburbs, I think we've got something that's laid out in the Norman period that relates to the Norman activity at the monument. Down at Kingsbridge, I think we've probably got something that's early medieval, but these are all just hypotheses at the moment. I want to just finish up really by talking about symmetry and scale, because when you look at this monument, okay, it is an absolutely enormous monument. Now, we archaeologists often get laughed at for staring at LiDAR, this aerial view, and translating sort of social and cultural elements of society. No one in the medieval world would have seen this monument like this. Okay, so it's a very handy form of surveillance. But how was that landscape experienced? Well, William Cobbett comes to my aid here because he describes Old Sarum as a stack of 3 cheeses. And I like that. And it doesn't matter how you approach the Salisbury Basin, whether you're coming in on the Winchester Road, the London Road, Exeter Road, or the Devizes Road, when you catch sight of Old Sarum, you can see that stack of 3 cheeses. Okay, this is a purposely symmetrical monument. And I say that because in the excavations conducted on the curtain wall here in the northeast quarter, the chalk is actually graded down to that height. Whereas when we go to the northwest quarter of the monument, where they worked on the curtain wall here, the land was lifted up, it was raised to create this terraplan, and it was raised between 20 and 25 feet. This is an enormous undertaking to build a cathedral on top of. No wonder it had structural issues. This is a vast undertaking, and if anyone's ever visited the site, just the banks and ditches are unsurpassed. And if you read the popular literature, or not even the popular literature, the academic literature on Old Sarum, it gets these sort of fleeting references. No one really engages with the scale of this monument. It's described as exceptional by one commentator, and I'm not a fan of that word because I think it precludes comparative analysis. But in some ways, this monument is exceptional in terms of its size and its scale. There's nothing really quite like it. And if we think about what the Normans were trying to do, are they trying to create a centre of ducal authority in southern England that can match Winchester for scale and power? That's very much what William did at Caen, having been born here. We look at the size, this is all the same scale. We look at the size of Old Sarum, it's absolutely vast compared to these two. So there's a real vision for what this site is going to be. And really interestingly, that Norman church, the Holy Cross, sits at exactly the same distance that the 2 churches, extramural churches, do in both Falaise and Caen as well. So I think there's a plan, there's a design here. But what's even more interesting is that the Normans stick their motte smack bang in the centre of this monument. Now, if we look at every other Norman motte inserted into a pre-existing settlement, whether it's Roman walls or whether it's so somewhere like Pevensey, for example, or whether it's an Anglo-Saxon borough, somewhere like Wallingford, even Iron Age hill forts, the motte is always placed on the edge, right next to the perimeter wall, whereas here it is smack bang in the middle. What is going on in the minds of these colonisers? And I do wonder whether there's a very secular vision of power here being played out. But by putting the motte in the centre, this is reflecting the divine providence that the Normans felt they had been given by the Lord. This was their view of their project. And I'm not going to go into this in too much depth because I talk about it. Be talking about it at the conference in July. But my sense is that we should read this monument as a statement of how the Normans viewed their colonial power and their colonial project. It's a document I think is important as a Doomsday Book, as the Buyer Tapestry, for what it has to tell us about that Norman project. And if we want to read off a sequence of decision making from this monument between 1066 and 1090, it's very, very clear to see, to me, the church was an afterthought. And there are the fracture lines. And I think that vision of a colonial power, as we all know, it never works, is ultimately why this monument fails as a place of settlement and occupation. So it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Some of this work I am now publishing here, open access in the Antiquaries Journal, is a piece that I've done on some shackles that were found at Old Sarum. I've tried to place those in context. I've got a paper, as I say, coming up at the Anglo-Norman Studies Conference in July, where I'll talk more about this, the rise and fall of a Norman power base in southern England. But what we've got coming out in July is an edited volume. I've edited that with Hadrian Cook. It's packed with the work of local scholars, people with a huge amount of expertise on this monument and Salisbury, and a huge amount of passion for it. I'm really excited by this book. Much of what I presented today is found within the chapters that I have written for this book, and there's a draft cover for you as well. So I'm going to finish up there and just leave you with a very big thank you to all of the people, from school kids, volunteers, staff, students, that have supported me over the course of the last 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. What I've known this site, that's the timer. I've known this site since I was a school kid, and today you've really made me rethink it and see it in a different light, which is always a refreshing thing to happen. I'm particularly struck by the way I'm someone who works on deserted Roman towns in Italy, elsewhere. But what we're seeing here is effectively the equivalent for the medieval period. And they do, as you've shown us, just provide such a way into a whole series of big issues. So thank you very much indeed. We're open for questions. Can I just ask one very simple question? I suspect simple. All those early 20th century excavations, is the material there, the artifacts and so forth, to be reworked, or is it dispersed and impossible?
So yes, actually, they're in the galleries at Salisbury Museum. What was kept back?
Yeah.
So some bits and pieces weren't kept back, and actually a plane crashed into the site hut, and I can't remember the date. I thought it was 1920, but I think a bit later. So some bits got dispersed, quite literally. But no, what those excavators thought were the most significant finds were kept back, and they found their way into Salisbury Museum, which is working on it's got a fantastic Wessex gallery, which has got a lot of this material. The stonework was divided up between two collections, so the museum and a collection that's gone on to be owned by English Heritage as well. But of course, a lot of the day-to-day stuff, frustratingly, and a lot of the kind of everyday pottery wasn't kept back.
Yeah. Thanks. Open the floor for questions and comments. Please.
Apart from the obelisk cathedral, how much development was there within the bay before the end of the 12th century?
Well, that's just the thing. The only excavations are around that cathedral complex, and you've got the cloister, you've got the well house, which may have been repurposed, the Bishop's Hall, and there's a range there. There's a series of buildings to the west of the towers, and they suspect the towers were toppled into the monument because those buildings continued in use. And then there's a handful of buildings that they started to uncover as they worked south. But with the outbreak of war in 1914, the 1915 season was in effect William Hawley and some other labourer who he doesn't name in his diary. It's a lot about how they felt about their staff back then. But otherwise, there's no concrete evidence of other medieval structures. I mean, to be fair, Chris has done some GPR in the monument, some test GPR in the monument, and there do look to be some kind of retaining walls and some quite substantial structures. So it's quite exciting, the potential. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you very, very much indeed, Alex. And that was extremely, as Martin has said, thought-provoking and stimulating for a site that you thought you knew and now realise there's a vast amount more there. I was particularly interested in your final proposal that somehow the remarkable situation of Mott within this very remarkably round hill fort reflects the Norman sense of themselves, but the way you put it was very, very much in the present, their world view, and sort of we're at the centre of it, because in fact the approach that I tend to take to Old Sarum and indeed other sites around it, and the very famous Stonehenge, of course, is that there's such a remarkable weight of a sense of a deep, deep history running through all of these things, and in many ways quite an unknowable history. So that, for instance, we've got a very, very early Anglo-Saxon chronicle reference to Sarrowyrig as a place in which somehow is conquered from the Britons. It may or may not have happened, but they wanted to assert that it happened because they were thinking about it in those terms. Now, I don't think these two things are incompatible at all, but I would be interested to, the Normans' sort of self-confidence must have been there pretty much everywhere they imposed themselves. Was there something special about Old Sarah, or some of the Old Sarah, that made them do it in that way, if I may dare nudge things a little bit, such a historical landscape?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, because what I've often said is knowing what's going on in the early medieval period, in immediately before 1066, is really important to understanding what the Normans were doing. You know, are they taking on a site like somewhere like South Canterbury that's maybe experiencing in the early 11th century a sort of meteoric rise, or are they working with a greenfield site where they're playing out their ideas of their power, and as you say, connecting to a much deeper ancestry, and an Iron Age and a Roman ancestry, and saying, like they do at Colchester, we're the new emperors. And I think the Mott, what's quite interesting about the Mott is it does these ideas of verticality in the Norman world, going up, having these donjons that you can see from distances, those seigneurial statements. I wonder whether that extra tier, that top cheese, if you like, in the cheesecake, is about that verticality and saying, here's the new hierarchy. There's a new tier in this landscape. Elaine Jameson, to be fair, mentions Old Sarum as an example of appropriating the power of that Iron Age landscape. But I wonder whether there is a consciousness that there's a Roman site there as well. So yeah, is it deep time they're tapping into that deep historical landscape? Or is there actually something quite important going on? Wilton's been trashed by the Vikings in 1006, 1009, I think. It's just too small, it's cramped. They need something of stature, maybe in the early 11th century. So maybe quite a lot's being thrown at it then. And that's maybe why the Normans, modify it. So it is one or the other. It's one or the other. Then, as you say, not incompatible, but I think there is an emphasis to be placed.
An online question. Could you tell us what happens next? Is there more work to be done?
Well, I don't know. It's taken God knows how long just to get like 20 test bits and get all of this together, and what with lots of other commitments. I think I'd like to think that off the back of the next few publications, there's conversations about what could be done in that monument to better understand it. But I'm very conscious of the fact that archaeology in the present day, when it's expensive, it's maybe not the top priority for a lot of institutions who are battling with cost cutting and I think climate change. So I think whatever's designed, any intervention that's designed needs to really work with local communities. It needs to be performative, which is what a lot of archaeology is. It is about discovering. It is about placemaking. It needs to have stitched into it a program of engagement and education. It's the monument has hosted events before. It's tricky. There's only one way in, same way out, which does make you think there wasn't a market up there, because you can imagine the traffic jams. So it's tricky. But I like to think that the work that's been put together would now inform very sort of keyhole surgical interventions that might help to address some of these particular questions.
Are there any other questions or comments?
There must have been a good deal of wealth in land belonging to the Norman, or covered by the Normans, and also a good deal of population to build on that scale.
Yeah.
And we don't know why.
Well, why or how? I mean, when William's troops come back from harrying the north, he famously keeps back the less enthusiastic amongst them for 3 weeks, I think it is. He keeps them back down. I'm looking at you. He keeps them back at Sarum for 3 weeks. So I wonder whether there's an episode there. I think the Normans could very well have been drawing on traditional burgle corvée labour and saying, look, we're the new cheeses, this is the new fort, and it was a way maybe of investing people in that. Interestingly, Edward of Salisbury is, of all of the pre-conquest landowners, he's the one that survives with the most land, and he goes on to be the sheriff. So I wonder whether he was an agent of the Norman project, and I wonder how early on this idea was conceived. There's a suggestion in that relationship that it was conceived quite early on. And then, you know, the Oath of Sarum is really important, and the links between that and the Domesday Book. You know, we live in a society that prioritizes writing, text. So we almost fetishize the document, whereas actually to many in that world, it was deed, oath, and gesture. The actual ceremony really is Domesday. And that, I think, again, puts Old Sarum on the map as a majorly important constitutional place.
If there are no more questions, can we express our sincere thanks to Alex again? This has been a wonderful lecture and a wonderful project. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I give notice that the next meeting will be held on Thursday, the 21st of March, when we'll hear a paper, Heritage in Danger, Assessing and Documenting the Impact of Conflict in Libya, by Professor